Hello everyone, I am Madeleine and I'm here today to teach you about preserving your excess produce. We want to teach people how to make their kitchens more sustainable and waste-free. Workshops are a really fantastic way for people to learn and grow and expand on their skills that they've already got. What I really like about preserving and teaching and preserving workshops is it really gets you back in touch with what's in season, what you can grow at home that's in season, understands where food comes from, how it's produced, and it really makes you question what goes on in your kitchen and how you can kind of expand your repertoire and your skills. I've been working within the cooking schools and teaching them for about 5 years. I teach between preserving, low waste cooking, bread making, fermenting, and pasta and more. What I do find that is so beneficial for these sorts of workshops that are based around old food craft skills is they get you back in your kitchen and they really make you understand how your food is produced, where it's coming from, about seasonality, and really where you can start reducing waste at home. These days, what we have is fridges and freezers to stop this from happening too quickly. But before we had these modern techniques, we had to use old school practices. What we would do is preserve food, so you'd make jams or chutneys. You would cure things with salt, so you could cure meats and proteins. We would also bury things in the ground under snow, and then a really old one is actually drying products in the sun. So some of the first techniques that we saw of preservation back in the early days was, as I said, drying things in the sun, so you would dry out fruits and vegetables to make them last longer. Then you would go to burying things in the ground, because burying things in the ground is a lot cooler than being above the ground. So you would bury meats and other vegetables like potatoes to help them last longer. The main one that we saw in terms of using produce and doing something with it was fermentation, because fermentation uses salt, and salt is a really good fighter against bacteria. The last one we saw was pickling and preserving, because you can use alcohol and sugars and vinegar. And vinegar is actually soured booze or soured alcohol, so it kind of comes together. A lot of these practices were developed because they didn't have access to fresh produce all year round like we do. In the olden days, when they didn't have fridges and refrigeration, and they would have to go on long journeys to trade their produce, or soldiers and sailors and merchants would have to go on adventures, they would need food that could last, that could sustain them, and actually nourish them through these challenges. Nowadays, from the 19th century onwards, we've come up with what we call canning, and that's what we see a lot these days in terms of cans on the shelf. But it can also include jars and jarring and making these sorts of pickles and preserves. We fortunately do have access to fridges and freezers and the convenience of food around us these days. But what I want you to learn today is that these old school practices and old school skills are really great tips to have, and they really help you improve how and what you cook in your kitchen at home. But most of all, it really gets you excited about not throwing things out and using up what you've got at home and creating fantastic and exciting dishes out of them. Some examples of traditional old preservation techniques that we still see these days and are actually quite popular these days are things like the canned tomato. Very, very commonly used in our cooking, but the Italians at the end of each summer get their big crop of tomatoes that they've got, preserve them in either jars or cans to last them through those winter months when it's not accessible of fresh tomatoes. Next, chutneys and relishes. Actually originated in India, but across all our cultures you'll see how many different varieties of chutneys and relishes that we enjoy and consume on a daily basis. From Eastern European countries, you've got things like pickled and cured fish and a delicious sauerkraut, which is very, very popular these days. Another one is kimchi. Who doesn't love a kimchi at the moment? Really, really good, and from Korea, which is a really spicy kind of, I guess, umami kind of flavour, but very, very spice-driven in terms of chili. Another one you might see around is miso paste, which is from Japan, and they use it a lot in their cooking. It's a very salty kind of flavour, and it preserves their grains and legumes. And sometimes they can be made and actually made across a 100-year period. The two recipes that I'm teaching you today are about using up your excess produce and making your produce that you have got last longer. They're only going to be fridge-based pickles, which we'll talk more about later, but the fridge-based pickle still extends the shelf life of the produce that you might have laying around. Before we get into our recipes, I'm just going to talk to you about the basic science of what preserving food is. So why we mainly do it is because we want to extend the shelf life of this product. We take a product, say a cucumber or a fennel or a carrot or a pear or an apple, we take that product in its raw and natural state and we need to work with it so it can last longer. If we don't, what happens is there's things that are called microorganisms. And microorganisms feed into your food and make them start to break down. And that's when we don't want to consume them. Microorganisms come in forms of bacteria, yeasts, molds, and bacteria comes in good and bad forms. Good forms, which we've kind of just gone over, is fermentation. So when the bacteria grows in fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkrauts and misos, they're actually good for us to consume and our bodies enjoy consuming them. And it can be a good gut bacteria grower and all those sorts of health benefits. In the preserving that we're going to talk about today, we actually can't have the bacteria that grows inside these products. We want to inhibit that growth. And what we do to inhibit that growth is actually use what we call preserving agents. And these preserving agents are like our fighting force against bacteria and microorganisms. The main ones that you do use and that you'll see in recipes is vinegar, which is what we're using today in our chutney and our pickles. You can use sugar, which you use for jam making and bottling sweet fruits. Salt, which you use for curing meats or making preserved lemons. You've got alcohol, which is delicious in any sort of product, mainly kind of bottling fruits and that sort of thing. And then you've got oil, which is like your antipasto kind of preservation method. All right, so with today's class, our main preserving agent that we're going to be using is vinegar. And vinegar is going to be making our pickles and our chutney that we're going to be using today. The products are going to be, as I said, only able to be stored in your fridge. They're fridge because they're not being heat processed. And heat processing is a method that can kind of be quite a little bit complicated trying to explain it over video, so it's just best to do a fridge-based product. But if you would like to learn more about it, then you definitely can. I'll put some references down the bottom of your recipe card for you. The main thing is that what makes it shelf stable is that the jar lid has been sealed on correctly. And today we're not going to be sealing the lids on correctly. What I do find though is that the fridge pickles or chutney are very handy for a busy household. So I know that we don't have a lot of time, and sometimes if you just want to do a quick and easy chutney and it can be served and eaten within days, is a lot easier than making a big batch and having to make many jars for your house. So our first recipe that we're going to complete in this workshop is going to be your waste not, want not fridge pickle, like this one we've got here today. Just to explain what pickles are, they are any sort of vegetable or fruit or protein that is encased in a vinegar brine. So this liquid that is going around the jar at the moment is what you call the vinegar brine, and this is what makes your product last longer. Your vinegar brine for your fridge pickle today will contain 1 cup of hot water, 1 cup of vinegar. The vinegar that you choose is depending on what produce you're using and what you kind of have at home as well. I tend to use like an apple cider vinegar or a white wine vinegar for products that I want to see what's inside the jar. So you've got fennel, I've got carrot, I've got cauliflower and celery inside this jar. If I was to use a red wine vinegar, it would just dull out the produce in there and wouldn't really match in terms of flavourings for that. For a red wine vinegar, I would more suit it if you're going to pickle things like a beetroot or a grape or a plum, which are very nice. So your white wine vinegar and your apple cider vinegar are really great for using products that you want to highlight what's inside that jar. Your vinegar that you do purchase, if you can look, needs to be 5% acidity. And that's a really important thing when you're looking for vinegars that you're purchasing. It's between 5 and 7%, as I should say. So between that ratio, your vinegar acidity needs to be sitting. You can use also a rice wine vinegar, which is commonly used for kind of more Asian style pickles. So maybe if you're going to pickle ginger or pickle chilies, and use or pickled carrots and cucumbers, and use it more in say stir fries or salads or rolls and that sort of thing. That's where rice wine vinegar is really good for. So they're your main vinegars: apple cider vinegar, white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar, and rice wine vinegar. Just make sure you never ever use straight up white vinegar for your preserving. That vinegar, white vinegar, comes from no source of fruits or vegetables, so it's left for cleaning at home. Your other ones are perfect for you preserving your products. What else we will have in your brine today is sugar. Today I'm just using caster sugar because, as I said, I like to keep the colour in. So caster sugar has no colour and no flavour, so it's really good for using when you're making pickles. If you were making more of a richer pickle or a darker one, you could use more of a raw sugar or a brown sugar. But I do commonly just stick to caster sugar. As I said, it's got no colour and it's got no flavour, so it kind of just blends in with the product. What you can't see on here is a little bit of salt, but there is salt, and salt is very necessary when you're doing a savoury pickle. If you're doing a sweet pickle, I would leave it out, but it's very good for balancing the spices and the flavourings in your jar when you're making a savoury pickle. So that's your vinegar and what's in your brine. With your brine, it's always best to pour it on, especially when you're using your fridge pickles, it's always best to pour it on when it's hot. So today we're going to have hot water. We're going to do more of a quick and easy one instead of boiling it up, but you're just going to have some hot water, your vinegar, and then your sugar and your salt. Your sugar and your salt will go into your hot water. We're going to whisk it together and dissolve it, and then we're going to add your vinegar, and we'll be ready from there. What else that you can add into your pickles is your spices. So spices are really delicious and really good when you're making pickles, as they can add another element of flavour to your product. For the basic kind of ones that you would normally add into your pickles, there's things like mustard seeds, so your brown or yellow mustard seeds, fennel seeds, which I'm using today, peppercorns, you can use a white or a black peppercorn, coriander seeds are really great, dill seeds, I've also got a bay leaf here today, and then you can add things like fresh garlic or ginger or a fresh chilli or even chilli flakes. That's really nice. When you do choose your spices for your pickles, just make sure that you use a whole spice and not a ground spice. The whole spices are better at not making your product cloudy, and also just are very good at dispersing flavour better. So they're your spices. With today's product, I'm using about a 500ml jar. So I've got about 2 to 3 teaspoons of spices all up. If I was going to do a smaller jar, so a little jar like this, I'd probably do 1 to 2 teaspoons of spices. So just adjust it to what jar size that you're going to be using at home. So that's a good segue into what your storage containers can be to put your pickles in. So today I've got my glass jar that we're going to be using. So I've got some just clean glass jars. So you give it a very good rinse. You don't need to dry them out just because they're going to be going into the fridge. The other option is, which I've done here, is use a container and just, I would recommend more putting in a container like this because it slides easier into your fridge. So it means you're not going to take up too much space with a half-used container like this. But it is a good example that you don't just have to use a glass jar. With your containers, same sort of practice. Just make sure that your container is clean and not dirty and can be used from there. Alright, so what we're going to do now is first make our brine. So I've got some very hot water here, straight out of the kettle. At home will work for you, but I've just got some boiled water. So it's the cup of water, which first of all I'm going to add the sugar and the salt into, just so they dissolve. So you whisk them in, just so they nicely dissolve. Very good. And then we're going to add our vinegar. Today I have used a white wine vinegar, but as I said, you could use an apple cider vinegar as well. So we'll pop that in and whisk that all together. It is important to have your brine at least a little bit warm when you're making these fridge pickles, because it will help soften your produce. So we'll pop that to the side. Now we're going to talk about our produce. Today I've got some fennel. So fennel is a really delicious one coming into fennel season. Some leftover bits of celery that you might have had from a bunch of celery at home. And then some carrot. So what it is, today we're doing a bit of a mixed pickle. At home, if you wanted to, like I've done before, I've made just a straight up cabbage pickle. So just cabbage, and you could use a red or a white cabbage. Other produce that you can use up at home that might be in the bottom of your fridge at the end of the week is cauliflower. So the stems and the florets are really delicious. You could use beetroot, you can use green beans, you could put a little bit of onion in there, anything that you've got at home in the bottom of your pantry drawer, or your fridge drawer, is ready to be used. Just need to make sure it's not too soft and not really on the end of its life. So it's still got a little bit of texture and crunch to it, because when you have a pickle, you still want to have a little bit of crunch to it. So with today, because we're doing a more of a fridge pickle, it's best to finely slice your produce up. So we're going to pop some fennel in there. So with your fennel, this is really delicious and the fronds should be used. So what we're going to do, as I said, we're going to finely slice it up. So we're going to take our knife and finely slice it up. If you have just the white part, you could be using that as well. But I don't mind these top little parts. They're a little bit more fibrous, but they're very, very delicious and friendly. So finely slice that one up. This is really a recipe for using up what you've got at home and in your fridge, as I said. So if you had half a carrot left in your fridge, if you had a bit of onion, if you had a few green beans, you can do that. But if you just want to make up a straight jar of fennel pickle, so say you had one fennel left that you didn't use at the end of the week, you could definitely just do a simple jar of fennel pickle as well. Pickles are really, really great at cutting through fatty products, because they've got that acidity which helps you cut through. So if you've got like a fatty piece of pork, that's where fennel pickle is really delicious. If you had a nice piece of baked fish, you could add some on top. They're very good adding to slaws, so pickles and slaws are fantastic. And they're very good, as we all hopefully know, on our cheese plates. And so these sorts of products that you'll have in your fridge are very good and very handy if you have people pop in very quickly and you need something to add to a cheese plate. Or if you're like me, you just eat pickles straight out of the jar. So we just finely slice our carrot up as well. That should be plenty. Pop that there. And then our last one is our celery. So the celery is the same thing, cut it really thin and fine. If this is where you've bought your bunch of celery and you haven't used it for when you've made your soups, you haven't used it for your snacks of celery and peanut butter, or you haven't used it in other salads, pickled celery is very, very delicious. And if you're making something like a tabbouleh or a slaw that called for celery and didn't have it, just replace it and use your pickled celery. It's a great option to have on hand. Alright, so that should be plenty of produce. So I'm just going to do one jar just to show you today. I'm going to do the 500ml jar. So that should be enough produce to fill this one jar. If you have extra produce, just pop it in the little smaller jars as well. Don't ever pop it in a big glass jar that can't fit in your fridge or is going to take up too much space. You kind of want to be able to still have access to your fridge as well. So we've got our clean jar. As I said, you could use a container as well. We've got our spices. So I'm going to gradually layer the spices in the jar as we go. I'll pop some down the bottom. So I've got fennel seeds, I've got peppercorns, and I've got coriander seeds today. And I will pop a bay leaf in there. And you can't just mix up your produce. We pack it in. You don't need to be too fancy. Awesome. We don't need to be too fancy when you pack it in. You just kind of throw everything in together and move it all about. Put a little bit more spices. Now with your bay leaf, just so it's on the outer edge of your product, it's best to add it in halfway through. You kind of just tuck it down the side there, and so then you'll have a kind of beautiful bay leaf like that one on the outside. And you keep going in, just layering up. And then you don't want to pack it too tight. So you want to still have some space because the vinegar brine still needs to be able to coat every part of your produce. So you want to make sure you kind of underpack it to begin with and don't have your product or your fruits and vegetables sticking out the top of the jar. Kind of pack just to below where the jar seal will begin. So kind of just to that part there. We then grab our hot vinegar, brine. I'm going to pour into a jug. And what we're going to do is going to very gently pour our vinegar brine into our jar. Add some more spices on top. Not too many spices. We get our beautiful product. We pour our hot vinegar brine. I like to pick my jar up and tip the jar to an angle and then gently pour the vinegar brine in. You don't want to pour too quickly because the quicker you pour, the more air bubbles you're going to get. And then we nearly fill it up to the top. So we can kind of see it's at the same position where I said to put your produce, so just below the seal of the jar. And what we do now is we're going to get rid of air bubbles. So even though this is still going to be a fridge pickle, it's really important that we do get rid of air bubbles. So we grab a knife or a chopstick and you push the knife down the side of the jar. And if you packed your jar too tightly, you wouldn't be able to move the knife in through the jar like that. If it was so tight that you can't do that, just remove some produce, because that means that core centre isn't going to be covered in vinegar brine. So we get our knife, you can kind of see some air bubbles poking, dispersing themselves out. So we move it all around. And just make sure we're getting everything nicely coated in that vinegar brine. You want all your vegetables pickled. So it's a nicely packed jar, there's still a little bit of space in there. And then what we do, we've got a little bit extra bits and bobs, you can try and pop them in there. And then, in the end, you just want to have a little bit of space between the jar, end of the jar lid and the product. But you just want to make sure everything that you're pickling is submerged underneath that vinegar brine. What's exposed to oxygen has a high chance of deteriorating or going off. So if everything's submerged under the brine, it's going to be safe inside that jar. So I just pour a little bit more on, just to make sure that I still have space between the jar lid and the product. You then grab your jar lid and pop it on. And there we go. You've got some delicious quick pickles. What you do now is I let them sit on your bench and just let them cool. You just want them to cool down a little bit because you don't want to put hot things in the fridge. Just let them cool down for a couple of hours, and then once they've cooled, pop them in the fridge, and these will last you up to 2 months in your fridge. Whenever you use them, make sure you just use a clean spoon or clean utensil when you're pulling them out. Don't get your dirty spoon you're just eating cereal with and get them out. Make sure you get a nice clean fork or a nice clean knife, and that will keep the inside of that jar clean and prevent it from getting bacteria and such. If you've popped them in the fridge and you come back in a couple of weeks and the lid pops and there's lots of bubbles, air bubbles and a little bit of fizziness, unfortunately something has gone wrong with your pickles, and I would be cautious and I would throw them out, just because the fermenting side of it isn't meant to occur in this sort of preservation. Otherwise, they should be good. The vinegar brine, so the product that the pickles are sitting in, the vinegar brine, that should be used once your pickles are out of the jar. So once you finish your pickles, you've got the vinegar brine left in there, that's a ready-made salad dressing for you. So what you do is you get that part of vinegar, you add a bit of oil, add a bit of mustard or a bit of honey, a bit of salt and pepper, mix it all about, and then you've got a really, really delicious, flavour-packed salad dressing. So it's a really great way to make sure you use everything up that's inside that jar as well. As I said, just wait a couple of days when you put them in the fridge until you can eat them, just because you want to let that flavour and the spices kind of develop. But otherwise, after a couple of days, you've got a couple of months to eat them, and they'll be delicious on your grilled meats or fish, very nice through salads and slaws, and very, very good on that cheese plate. All right, so we've made our pickles, and now we're going to work on our fridge chutney. This is very much a bit of a rescue what you've got in your fruit bowl or fridge recipe, and is a smaller batch. If you really wanted to, or if you had the capacity to, you could definitely double and triple it. The one thing that I do recommend when you start doubling and tripling recipes, everything's fine to double and triple except for the vinegar. If you add too much vinegar, which happens when you double and triple recipes, it just means it's going to cook for a really long time and it can be very vinegary. So whenever you double a recipe for a chutney, you 1.5 times the vinegar. So So that's your only thing that you need to change. If it's too sweet for you, you could definitely drop the sweetness down as well. But otherwise, everything else is good to go. So in your chutney today, we have got apples. We're just going to do a wrinkly apple chutney. I know we are all people that buy a bag of apples think we're going to eat them, and then they get to that kind of wrinkly kind of point, and you can only bake so many apples or make so many apple crumbles. And apple chutney is really, really good to have in your fridge. It's delicious with roast pork, if you have roast pork at home, but it's also very nice on your toasted cheese sandwiches or on a cheese plate, and just very nice just to have as an extra condiment to any sort of kind of roasted, delicious vegetable goodness. So definitely have an apple chutney in your fridge. So you've got apples, any sort of apples are fine. You could use Pink Ladies, you could use Fuji, you could use Royal Gala. If you were going to use Granny Smith, I would just suggest to peel those because their skin can be a little bit bitter. But if you watch your other workshop, you might be able to use those peels for something else. But otherwise, I just got a Pink Lady today, so definitely use those. If you didn't have enough apples, so on the recipe it says 3 to 4 apples, I would use a pear, so I could substitute in a pear or two. So if you were 2 apples, I'd add a pear or 2 in. If you had, say, a chunk of pumpkin left or half a beetroot left, I would grate the pumpkin or beetroot in as well, and it would turn it into a bit of a veggie kind of apple kind of chutney. And that sweetness from the apple with the pumpkin or beetroot, it's actually a really nice combination, so it's a good one to do as well. As I said, grate the pumpkin or the beetroot in just because they're a lot, they're quite a lot firmer than apple, and they just need a lot longer to break down. So grating it in, and you've got chopped apples, will kind of cook at the same pace, which is what you want. On your recipe card, we've also got spices. So with your spices, we've got some delicious ginger, so just some freshly grated ginger. You can add some garlic if you wanted to as well. You've got some ground cinnamon and ground clove, which is really good, and some mustard seeds. If you also like to add some chili flakes or cayenne pepper, if you like it a little bit hot, would be really nice as well. But any sort of ground spices are good to use. You could use some ground coriander, some ground fennel seeds, ground cumin seeds. Even if you didn't have fresh ginger, you could use ground ginger. Mustard seeds are always really good in chutneys. They kind of add that kind of bitter, kind of savoury part to it. But I know we all have a lot of spices in our pantry that we need to use up. So chutneys are a really great place for spices to be added. We've got sugar. So today's sugar I'm going to be using brown sugar. On your recipe card, I say you can use raw or caster. So it just depends how deep and rich you want your chutney to be. So with the brown sugar today, it's going to make it quite a little bit sweeter, a bit more molassesy kind of flavoured. If you just wanted a simple kind of chutney, I would just use a caster sugar, which would just kind of give it a sweetness but not too dark kind of molasses kind of flavours to it. The other one we've got, which is an important part, which is our preserving agent, is our vinegar. So the vinegar that I will be using today is going to be an apple cider vinegar because I'm going to match it to the apples. But if you didn't have apple cider vinegar on hand, I would use a white wine vinegar, or in this one you could use a red wine vinegar. They would both work. With the brown sugar, I would easily use both of them. The red wine vinegar will give it a little bit more of a mulled kind of apple kind of chutney flavour. You might want to change the spices to match that. And the white wine vinegar will just kind of be similar to the apple cider vinegar, so keeping it a little bit lighter and a little bit fresher. So yeah, definitely use any of those sorts of vinegars. Same with the pickling tip, just make sure that your vinegar is sitting between the 5 and 7% acidity ratio. If your apples are a little bit drier, then during the cooking process, we might just need to add a little bit more liquid. And instead of adding more vinegar and making it too vinegary to consume, we just might add a little bit of water. But we'll come to that and we'll see how it's looking later on. Otherwise, they're your ingredients that we're going to be using today. For your storage of this, you can either store it in your clean jars, so just make sure your jars are nice and clean. And if you didn't have any jars, same as before, just store it in a container. So just your container that you've got at home, and just make sure it's a clean container. Your chutney will last in the fridge for at least 2 months as well. There's enough vinegar and enough sugar in there to make it last longer. And same practice, just make sure you use a clean spoon or clean knife when you're using your chutney or adding it to your dish, just so you don't want to get any bacteria inside your jar. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to chop our onion, just using a brown onion, but if you did have a red onion at home, or half a red and half a brown, you could definitely add both of those in. We just top and tail our onion, cut it in half, and then we peel the skins off. And like before, if we reference back to the first Everyday Low Waste Cooking workshop, we keep our onion skins and we make the stock out of them, make our veggie scrap stock. So I will put those to the side and make sure they're used later. With your onion, you can either finely slice it up or dice it. I'm just going to finely slice it up today. Just so it's in the little half moon shapes. I kind of like to have strips of onion in my chutneys and such at home. But for these little chunky bits at the end, I do kind of slightly dice them up. Nice slice. And then we're going to use our stovetop. I'm going to saute this down. So there will be a little bit of noise coming from our induction. So just bear with me if you kind of can't hear too much, but hopefully it won't be too loud. So I've just got a little bit of veggie oil here today. You could use olive oil as well, or a mix of veggie and olive, whatever you've got in your pantry at home. So just pop 3 tablespoons in your recipe, but just pop a drizzle in your pot. I'm just going to let that warm up a little bit. We're going to add our onions in. With our onions, I'm just going to add a little bit of salt. It just kind of helps your onions soften down a little bit quicker when they're sauteing in your pot. So put that on, pop our onions in. So you'll just have to go with the cooking sounds and noises. Pop our salt in. Alright, so we've got our onions in the pot. So stir. We just want to soften those up gently. We don't want them to caramelise too much, get too much colour. Mainly just to kind of soften them and become a little bit more translucent. Raw onion in chutney and relish isn't very nice. You kind of want to at least saute them down to get rid of that flavour. Now we're going to go with our apples. As you can see, I'm keeping our apple skin on, especially the pink ladies. They're really beautiful, soft skins, so they break down in the cooking. With the apples, I like to just do kind of like chunks. So you don't need to be too fussy, it doesn't matter if they're not the right size. So a couple of centimetres, 2 by 2 nearly, that kind of size. We just kind of roughly chop those up. Now a question that is asked a lot in chutney and relish making is what is the difference between a chutney and a relish? Mainly so a chutney, which we're doing today, is classified as a product which is cooked for a longer period of time, so it can be over an hour or so, whereas a relish can be quite short. Chutney is normally using produce up, so like today we're using up some apples that are getting a little bit tired and old. They can be normally quite fruit based, so apples and pears, pumpkin chutney, so really cooking it down. The product that is used, I'm using a pear. So a product when you're making chutney that you use normally softens down quite a lot. It kind of turns into a bit of a mush in the end. You can't really identify what's inside the jar. So with this apple chutney, if you were to mix it with pears, you really couldn't tell. It's kind of just turned into each other. Chutneys are also very spice driven, so they're heavy on spices, so lots of warming spices like your cinnamon, your clove, your allspice, lots of pepper, and then some ginger and such in there as well. And they kind of turn very glossy and thick in the end. A relish, on the other hand, is more of a product that is shorter cooking time, so it can be quite a quick one, so it might only be half an hour, a little bit. And then they're very, very produce driven, so it's about highlighting that produce that you're using. So a relish will have like grated beetroot, big strips of capsicum, very nice strips of onion that's been sauteed down, so like a beautiful onion relish. And you're really highlighting that produce. It's not entirely spice driven. It's not going to hide the fruit and the produce that you're working with. You want to be able to taste that beetroot still, or taste that capsicum still. And there's always texture left in the produce. So it's normally that a relish will have bite left. And it kind of turns into more of a sauce and not a kind of glossy kind of product in the end. It's more of like a lighter, fresher version. What about onions? Sauteing down. So I've chopped 3 apples. I have chopped 3 apples. If they were a bit smaller, you could go in with 4, but I'm just going to stick to the 3 today because that's actually a good amount. So we've got our onions which are sauteing down. We're next going to add in our spices. So this is our ginger. So as I said, if you didn't have fresh ginger, you could definitely use ground ginger. I've got clove, I've got cinnamon, and I've got some mustard seeds. So pop that in. You just want your spices to kind of, and the ginger to saute a little bit, it's become fragrant, as we say. And mix that around. If you can be here right now, you'll be smelling some delicious cinnamon smells. Hopefully when you make it at home, you'll get the same smells. So we're going to cook that down. Put it down a little bit. Just going to add a touch of pepper. So a little bit of pepper. Add that in. And then we're going to go in with our apples. So if you've got your apples, if you had your pears mixed in, or if you had some of the beetroot or pumpkin, that's where you add that in. And just give that another very good stir. You just kind of want to coat all the spices and the flavourings around the apple. Get it all nicely mixed together. Just make sure your spices aren't sticking to the bottom of the pan too much. There we go. So at this point, we've got all of our ingredients that we mainly need in there. So our spices, our apple, onion, nicely cooked down. We've just got our brown sugar and our vinegar. So when you put your brown sugar and your vinegar in, keep it on kind of like a low to medium heat. We don't want it to cook too fast, because if you cook it too fast and too quickly, you're going to dry out the vinegar and you're going to have to add more liquid. So if you cook it a little bit more lower and slower, it means that the vinegar will have time to soften the apples. The apples also release a little bit of their own liquid, so they kind of get a little bit, the apple juice kind of releases, which gives it some more liquid to work on. And when sugar melts as well, it kind of gets its own liquid. So, as I said, at the end, it looks like it's going to need a little bit more liquid. So it's kind of drying out, the apples haven't softened completely yet. That's when you would just add a little bit of water. I'd say maybe 1/4 cup, and then let that cook out for like another 10 or so minutes, and then you should be nearly ready to be done. You'll know when your chutney is ready. It's when it turns into that kind of thick, glossy mass, which is what I was talking about, knowing the difference between a chutney and a relish. It really gets this beautiful shine to it, and it all kind of starts to thicken up. You'll still have beautiful chunks of apple that you'll be able to eat, but they're quite soft, and they'll be really kind of melt in your mouth moment. It will take around 30 to 40 minutes, just in a low, slow heat. Just keep stirring it. You can't just go now and walk away and leave for that time. It does need to be stirred every 5 minutes or so. When it gets to the more thicker point, it needs to be stirred every couple of minutes. So just keep an eye on it to stay in your kitchen. Otherwise, we'll come back when that's nearly ready. All right, so our apple chutney has been cooking down, and we're going to see how it looks when it's finished. So as we can see in the pot here, everything's softened, cooked together. We've got a nice kind of thick, kind of glossy product. You can see that beautiful gloss on top of your apples and everything. The spices are smelling very, very, very delicious. and it's ready to be popped away. With your chutney, you can either jar it or we can pop it into a container. I'm going to pop it in a container today, easy to pop in the fridge sometimes. So any sort of container you've got at home, whatever works for you. And we pop this in here. So you can see the delicious mustard seeds in there, beautiful chunks of apple, nice slices of the onion. You can see how much a very small amount of 3 apples and 1 onion can make. This will probably last, in my household, maybe not even a month, just because it's so delicious. But I will just let that cool down before you pop your lid on. So just make sure it's kind of cooled down a little bit. We don't want to add too much extra liquid in there when we put the lid on. Let it cool down on your bench and then pop the lid on and then you pop it in the fridge. As I said, in the fridge it will last you a couple months, so it's a really good one to have. Chutneys are very delicious, used on your morning eggs, so if you like scrambled eggs on toast or poached eggs on toast, really, really yum. I love it in a very naughty 3 cheese toast sandwich because apple and the vinegar kind of helps cut through that really fatty part of the cheese, but it's really, really good. Very nice for a quick sauce to have with your roasted pork. If you have your roasted Sundays, instead of making apple sauce, you've got some really good apple chutney. And just a really good product to have in your fridge. If you have someone that needs a little gift, you could pop a jar of your chutney on their front doorstep and just say, store it in the fridge and use within this time. Just let them know what's in it. But a jar of pickles or chutney is a really great little gift. But yeah, we'll pop the lid on, then you pour it in your fridge and you're good to go. Okay, well we've made our 2 fridge stable pickles and preserves, and these have been using up what you've got left over in your fridge at home. So really about rescuing what's about to kind of end its life in the fridge drawer, on your kitchen bench, in the fruit bowl, that sort of thing. So you've got your delicious jar of pickles, and this has got your fennel and your carrot and some celery, but as I said, you can use your cauliflower, green beans, a bit of beetroot, some cabbage, some onion, your fresh chilli. So really using up what you've got at home. Serve it with your grilled meats or cheeses, very nice out of the jar, and also very good in sandwiches and wraps. And then we've got our delicious chutney, which is our apple chutney, and we could use that on your poached eggs and your cheese sandwich, with your roast pork. And this is where you've used up some wrinkly old apples. You could use up some pears, or you could add some grated beetroot or pumpkin in there as well. So both really using up what you've got at home. As I said, they're both fridge pickles, so they need to be stored in your fridge and only your fridge. They'll last you a couple of months in there. If any of them start to look a little bit funky or a little bit old, I would just get rid of them. But we can go more into that when you guys and I meet up and we have our little online discussion. So if you do have any questions from today, any more tips you'd like to learn about things, save up your questions and we'll have a chat when we have our online discussion. But mainly I want you to take away from today about what you can use at home, about what you've got, about reducing your kitchen waste, and really kind of getting adventurous and getting back into your kitchens and embracing what you've kind of already got on hand and not going out and buying new things. It's a really big kind of aspect of reducing our food waste, is not just going out and buying things for no reason, but using up what we've got and what we've got at home. But thanks for having me, and we'll chat soon. Thank you.
To watch more of these great videos, follow the link below to register. These workshops are free and full of practical hints and recipe ideas to help you reduce your kitchen waste and also save time and money.